smaller states, but also to even some of the larger states, that it is the only part of the Constitution that can never be changed, even by constitutional amendment. Because the government of the United States was to be a federal republic, or what is sometimes called a compound republic, the states were expected to elect both the Congress and the president. The selection of electors followed this pattern created in which the people in the states elect members of the House of Representatives, and the state legislatures of each state chose the members of the Senate. The delegates rejected the idea of just letting Congress choose the president because this would reduce him to a mere creature of that body. They also understood that Congress, with its power to make laws, would be the most powerful branch of the new government. They gave the president a veto power as a check on this awesome power. This led the convention to create a system whereas the states would choose electors, who would then choose the president. How many electors would each state have? Following the pattern established with the Great Compromise on the congressional representation, each state legislature could then choose, by whatever method they determined, a number of electors equal to their combined members of the representatives and the senators. Thus, the larger states would have more say in the election of the president, but would also protect the people in the smaller states by forcing more respect for their interest as well. Significantly, the electors would not meet together, but rather in their state's capital city. The very term electoral college was a later invention, not even being referred to in federal law until 1845. Electors are chosen for their independent judgment. Another assumption apparently made by the constitutional framers was that each elector could use his own judgment in how he cast his vote. A comparison could be made to the members of the House of Representatives. Although these individuals are chosen by the popular vote within their congressional districts, and not only by some national popular vote, they are not bound to vote any particular way on the issue that comes before them. It was thought that the members of the House of Representatives would be chosen by their character, their views, as expressed in their campaign, and their independent judgment. These qualities were important since the founders did not intend for the average citizen to vote on each national issue, leaving that up to their congressional judgment. As George Will stated, representatives are supposed to deliberate about the national interest. And if citizens did not like the way their congressman voted, they could just vote him out at the next election. Similar expectations were made of presidential electors. It was hoped that they would make a careful study of the various men who could potentially serve as the nation's president and make a deliberative judgment. While each elector would cast his own individual vote, it was assumed each would benefit from the discussion with the other electors in their state before making the final decision. Evolution of the Electoral College. One reason that the Electoral College system does not operate exactly as expected by the framers of the Constitution is that they left the electoral selection method up to each state legislature. In the first presidential election, the legislatures of Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, New Jersey, and South Carolina simply appointed electors. Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland picked their electors with a popular vote. Maryland set up its election for electors on a general ticket, but directed that 5 were to be residents from the Western Shore, and 3 were to be from the Eastern Shore. New York did not even choose any electors, as their legislature could never agree on how to proceed before the election of the first president. It made little difference in the first presidential election, as George Washington was the unanimous choice. 9 of the 15 state legislatures chose the electors in the second presidential election, which Washington also won by unanimous vote. By the 1830s, however, most states had gone to using a state popular vote method. The Constitution provided that the person had to obtain a majority of electoral votes in order to be elected, not just a plurality. Failure of any one candidate to gain the majority of the electoral vote would mean that the election would then be determined by the House of Representatives. This has happened twice, with Jefferson winning in 1801 and John Quincy Adams winning in 1825. The Constitution requires that each state's delegation of House members cast only one vote in that case. The Electoral College today. Although the Electoral College has evolved over the years, it remains a testimony to the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. If the president were chosen through a national popular vote election, the campaign would look much different than it does now. Instead of candidates paying so much attention to small states such as Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and Maine, They would instead camp out in the large urban centers where there are lots of voters. This would, of course, tilt the national policy away from the interest of what many of the east and west coast of the United States presently dismiss as flyover country. In fact, the presidential candidates in the general election would tend to fly over flyover country, spending little or no time campaigning there. Columnist William O'Rourke of the Chicago Sun-Times was quite explicit in his disdain for the country outside of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other great metropolitan areas, calling the less populated areas of the country Yahoo Nation. O'Rourke's description of the middle of the country was extremely vitriolic, ascertaining that that part of America that voted against Al Gore in 2000, quote, is a large, lopsided horseshoe, a twisted W, made up of primarily the Deep South and the vast, lowly populated upper far west states that are filled with vestiges of gun-loving, Ku Klux Klan sponsoring, formerly lynching-happy, survivalist-minded, hate crime perpetuating, non-blue-blooded, rugged individuals, end quotes. He added that these areas do not count, quote, one center of thinking America, and teeming centers of creative and intellectual life, end quotes. It should be noted that a popular vote in the presidential election may not necessarily reflect the winner of the popular vote under a presidential electoral methodology. After all, candidates could be expected to campaign much differently if they were trying to win the popular vote rather than attempting to win electoral votes by winning states. Neither Trump nor Clinton even bothered to campaign in California, the nation's largest state. It is a powerful demonstration of how a national popular vote could lead to that state dominating the national election. It could be noted that were the votes of California removed from the national popular vote, Trump would have actually finished ahead of Clinton in the popular vote, a swing of millions of votes. Controversially, millions of Republican voters living in the blue states who might have stayed home on election day because they couldn't influence the election might vote in a national popular election scenario. Strategy would be much different in a national popular vote election, rather than in an election determined by the electoral vote. After all, the game plan for a football game would be much different if the field goals counted as 4 points instead of 3, the touchdowns as 5 points instead of 6, or if total yardage were the way the winner was determined, rather than by touchdowns, field goals, and safeties. Determining a winner in a national popular vote election might even prove impossible. The 2000 election is particularly memorable since it took 36 days after the election before a winner was finally declared, and that delay was solely because of disputes concerning the popular vote in one state, Florida. Texas Governor George W. Bush ran first in that state by a mere 537 votes out of 6 million cast, giving him a narrow 271 to 267 victory in the Electoral College. Americans who are old enough can remember the spectacle of the recounting of the votes in a handful of Florida counties, in some cases even holding punch card ballots up to the light in an effort to determine the intent of the voter. Recounts are certainly an issue that would have to be resolved before the country could hold a meaningful national popular vote election for president. As it stands now, each state conducts its own recounts according to its own laws. But if the nation were to begin holding presidential elections based on the national popular vote, it is likely that a recount would be conducted by the federal agency. After all, what motive would the state have to spend funds to recount its votes in the circumstances that its own state election was not even close? And once the federal agency begins to conduct a presidential election with recounts, the detection of fraud, and ancillary issues, we would have to de facto national control of all elections. It would be rather impractical to have a national agency overseeing just the presidential election, and this would mean even more power has shifted from the states to the federal government. With a national popular vote election, in which fraud can no longer be contained within the borders of a single state or a handful of states, the temptation to stuff the ballot box would be obvious. And with a national popular vote, states would likewise be tempted to increase their vote totals. This could lead to spectacles of some states letting convicts inside state prisons cast ballots, allowing of foreigners, both legal residents and illegal, to vote, and maybe even letting children as young as 12 or younger cast ballots. After all, most young children could be expected to pad the results according to the views of their parents. Such shenanigans in one state would be unfortunate, but if the votes in the state that resorted to such unseemly tactics were allowed to affect the outcome of a national election, it would be tragic for our republic. Suggestions for reform. While the Constitution left the actual selection method of the state's electors in the hands of state legislatures, Madison and Hamilton were disappointed when Pennsylvania and Maryland opted to use a winner-take-all method. They had apparently assumed that each congressional district would choose one elector, with the other two then picked directly by the state legislatures. Since the Civil War, however, states have generally awarded all of their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in their state. Today, only 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, use the congressional district method favored by Madison and Hamilton. This year, Hillary Clinton won the statewide popular vote in Maine, but because Republican Donald Trump carried one of the state's 2 congressional districts, he gathered 1 electoral vote in Maine. If every state adopted this method, it would better maintain the federal character of the presidential election as envisioned by the founders than the present winner-take-all system prevalent across the country. Had this system been in effect in 2012, Mitt Romney would have been elected president over Barack Obama. Within the 26 states won by Obama, Romney actually won a plurality of votes in 99 congressional districts, while Obama won only 32 districts in red states. Opponents of this suggested reform argue that this would lead to state legislatures drawing congressional district lines so as to increase their state's clout in determining the winner of a presidential election, much as they now influence the makeup of Congress through gerrymandering. Actually, increasing the power of state legislatures in this selection of the president can be argued to be a good thing, because it would help restore some of the power of the states in the relationship with the federal government. If one's goal is for government to protect our lives, liberty, and property, then the preservation of the Electoral College would seem imperative.